Good evening all and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we are venturing into the oldest mountains in America, where the fog rolls thick through the hollows and the trees remember everything. The Appalachian wilderness has cradled secrets for centuries, from vanished souls to crimes that time refuses to bury, from unexplained horrors that defy every rational thought. These 10 accounts will take you deep into those forgotten places where help is miles away and something waits in the darkness. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Appalachian deep woods, where civilization ends and terror begins. I never believed that evil could have a physical presence until I took a job as a forest ranger in the Appalachian backcountry. My name is Lucas, and what I found in those mountains changed everything I thought I knew about human nature and the things people are capable of when they think nobody's watching. It was early spring when I accepted the position. The pay was decent, and honestly, I needed to get away from the city. Too many people, too much noise, too many complications. The ranger station assigned me to a remote sector near Copper Ridge, a sprawling wilderness area in eastern Kentucky that saw maybe a handful of hikers per season. Most of the trails were overgrown, and the nearest town was 40 miles of winding mountain roads away, perfect for someone looking to disappear for a while. They gave me a small cabin about 3 miles from the main access road. It was basic but functional. One room with a wood stove, a narrow bed, a table, and shelves for supplies. No electricity, no running water. There was a creek about 50 yards down the slope, and I had a hand pump for well water. Solar panels charged my radio and satellite phone. The solitude was exactly what I wanted. The first few weeks passed without incident. My job was simple: monitor the trails, check for illegal activity, maintain the fire watch points, document wildlife. I would hike 10 or 12 miles a day, taking notes, clearing fallen branches, replacing worn trail markers. The forest was waking up from winter. Birds were returning. Wildflowers pushed through the leaf litter. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. But there was something off about the northern section of my territory. The map showed an old logging road that cut through a particularly dense stretch of woods. And there were notes in the station logs about an abandoned hunting camp somewhere up there. Previous rangers had mentioned it in passing, but nobody had bothered to investigate it thoroughly. It was outside the main patrol routes, and frankly, most guys did not want to hike an extra 6 miles just to look at some forgotten shack. Curiosity got the better of me about a month into the job. I packed a day bag and headed north, following the remnants of the logging road. It was barely visible anymore, just 2 faint tire ruts choked with saplings and underbrush. The forest here felt different, darker. The canopy was thicker, and even though it was mid-morning, the light struggled to reach the ground. No birds sang. I did not hear a single squirrel or chipmunk the entire hike. I almost walked right past the camp. It was set back about 30 yards from the road, hidden behind a screen of laurel bushes. Only the dull glint of corrugated metal caught my eye. I pushed through the brush and found myself standing in a small clearing. There were 3 structures: a main cabin, larger than mine with boarded windows and a sagging porch, a storage shed with a rusted padlock hanging open, and a third building, low and windowless, that looked like it might have been a smokehouse or root cellar. Everything was weathered gray, and the clearing was unnaturally quiet. I approached the main cabin first. The door was unlocked, swollen in its frame but yielding when I put my shoulder into it. The interior was dim and stale. There was a table, overturned chairs, a metal bed frame with no mattress. Trash and leaves covered the floor. On the walls, someone had hung dozens of photographs, not framed, just tacked up with nails. I clicked on my flashlight and moved closer. They were hunting photos. Men in camouflage standing over deer, a black bear hanging from a tree, groups posing with rifles, standard stuff. But then I noticed something strange. In several of the photos, faces had been scratched out. Not torn down, just the faces scraped away with something sharp. It created this eerie effect, like the people had been erased but their bodies remained. I moved to the back of the room and found a closet, door hanging by one hinge. Inside were stacks of old magazines, more trash, and then something that made my stomach drop. Clothes, women's clothes, jeans, jackets, hiking boots, all piled in the corner like someone had just tossed them there and forgotten about them. They were stained, dark stains that I did not want to think too hard about. My hands were shaking as I backed out of the cabin. This was not right. None of this was right. I should have left then, called it in, let someone else handle it. But I needed to know. I needed to understand what this place was. The storage shed was next. Inside, I found the usual hunting camp supplies, propane tanks, old tools, camping gear. But there was also a workbench, and on that workbench were things that did not belong: zip ties, duct tape, a hunting knife with a 9-inch blade, dried blood still visible on the handle, and a plastic bin filled with identification cards and driver's licenses. I dumped the bin out on the bench. There were at least 20 IDs, all women, different ages, different states. I recognized one immediately because I had seen her face on a missing person poster at the ranger station. Sarah McKinney disappeared in 1996 while hiking the Appalachian Trail, never found. I was looking at a trophy collection. The third building was locked with a heavy chain and padlock. I did not have bolt cutters, but I found a pry bar in the shed. It took 10 minutes of sweating and cursing, but I finally broke the hasp free. The door swung open, and the smell that rolled out nearly made me vomit. Death, old death mixed with mildew and rot. Inside was a single room, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. No windows. Concrete floor with a drain in the center. Hooks bolted into the ceiling beams. And on the far wall, someone had carved names. Dozens of names scratched into the wood with desperate precision. I recognized 3 of them from the IDs I had just found. I stumbled out of that building and fell to my knees in the clearing, dry heaving. My mind was racing. This was a kill site. Someone had been using this camp to abduct and murder women for years, maybe decades. And based on the condition of everything, it had been abandoned relatively recently. Within the last few years at most. I grabbed my radio and tried to call it in, but the mountains blocked the signal. I would have to hike back to my cabin and use the satellite phone. I was about to leave when I heard something that froze me in place. A truck engine. Distant, but getting closer. Someone was coming up the logging road. I did not think. I just moved. I ran back into the tree line and crouched behind a fallen log, trying to control my breathing. The engine grew louder, and then I saw it. An old pickup truck, dark green, pushing through the overgrown road. It stopped at the edge of the clearing. A man got out. Late 50s, maybe older. Gray beard, worn flannel jacket, boots caked with mud. He looked around the clearing slowly, and then his eyes locked onto the third building. The broken padlock was lying in the dirt. He knew someone had been here. I watched as he walked to the building and looked inside. His body language changed immediately. Tension, anger. He turned and scanned the tree line, and for one terrible moment I thought he was looking right at me. Then he moved to the cabin and disappeared inside. I did not wait to see what he would do next. I moved as quietly as I could, crawling backward deeper into the forest before I dared to stand and run. I did not stop running until I reached the main trail, and even then I kept looking over my shoulder. It took me 2 hours to get back to my cabin. I grabbed the satellite phone and called the sheriff's office. I told them everything. The camp, the IDs, the names carved into the wall, the man with the truck. They told me to stay put and lock my door. Deputies would be there by nightfall. I did not sleep that night. Every sound outside made me jump. I kept the fire going and my knife within reach. Just before dawn, I heard vehicles approaching. The deputies had brought the state police and a forensic team. They searched the camp for 3 days. What they found was worse than I imagined. Beneath the third building, there was a crawl space. Inside that crawl space were remains, 7 bodies in various stages of decomposition. The oldest had been there for over a decade. The man I saw was arrested 4 days later at a house about 15 miles away. His name does not matter. What matters is that he confessed to 11 murders spanning 23 years. He had been a hunting guide in the area, which gave him access to the backcountry and a believable cover story. He would offer to take solo female hikers to remote locations, places where screams would not carry. The camp at Copper Ridge was where he brought them, to answer the questions I know people will have. Yes, I gave testimony at his trial. Yes, he was convicted and is currently serving multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. No, I did not continue working as a ranger in that area. I transferred to a different state within 6 months. But here is the thing that still haunts me. The forest knew. I'm not a superstitious person, but that northern section of woods felt wrong from the beginning. The silence, the darkness, the way the air itself seemed heavy with something unspoken. The land holds on to trauma. It remembers violence, and sometimes, if you are paying attention, it tries to warn you. I think about those women often, the names carved into the wall, the IDs in the plastic bin. Each one was somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, somebody's friend. They went into the mountains looking for beauty and peace, and they found a monster instead. The Appalachian wilderness is vast and ancient and indifferent to human suffering. It will swallow your secrets if you let it. That camp could have remained hidden for another 50 years. Those families might never have had answers. But something led me up that logging road on that particular morning. Call it chance, call it fate, call it whatever you want. I call it the last good thing I did before. The mountains broke something inside me that I am still trying to fix. My name is Grace, and I need to tell you about the night I picked up a hitchhiker who saved my life after she was already dead. I know how that sounds. I know you will have explanations, rational reasons why what I experienced could not have happened the way I remember it. But I was there. I saw her face, I heard her voice, and I am alive because of her. This happened 3 years ago in October. I was driving home from my second job, a late shift at a diner in Pikeville, Kentucky. The route took me through some of the loneliest stretches of Appalachian back roads you can imagine. Route 23 winds through the mountains like a black ribbon. 2 lanes of cracked asphalt with nothing but forest pressing in from both sides. No streetlights, no houses, no gas stations for miles at a time. It was just past 2 in the morning when I left the diner. I was exhausted, running on coffee and spite, but I needed the money. My car was a 15-year-old sedan that burned oil and made concerning noises whenever I went uphill, but it was paid for, and it ran, mostly. The first 20 minutes of the drive were uneventful. I had the radio on low, some late-night talk show I was not really listening to. The road was empty. I had not passed another vehicle since leaving town. The mountains rose up dark on either side, and the fog was starting to roll in the way it does in the hollows, thick and low to the ground. I was coming around a long curve when I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder of the road right at the edge of the headlight beams. A young woman, maybe in her early 20s. She wore a white dress, simple and old-fashioned looking, like something from a different era. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and she was barefoot. My first instinct was to keep driving. You do not stop for strangers on deserted mountain roads at 2 in the morning. That is common sense. That is survival. But something made me slow down. Maybe it was because she was a woman, and I am a woman. And I know what it feels like to be vulnerable and alone. Maybe it was because she looked so lost, standing there in the fog with her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. I pulled over about 20 feet past her and watched in the rearview mirror as she walked toward the car. She moved slowly, carefully, like her feet hurt. When she reached the passenger window, I rolled it down halfway. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Do you need help?" She looked at me with the saddest eyes I have ever seen. "I need a ride," she said. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Please, I need to go home." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to drive away. Something about her was wrong. The dress was wrong. The bare feet were wrong. The way she appeared out of nowhere, on a road where I had not seen a single house or turn off for miles. But her eyes were desperate, and I could not just leave her there. "Get in," I said. She opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. Up close, I could see that her dress was not just old-fashioned. It was genuinely old. The fabric was worn thin in places, and there were small tears along the hem. Her feet were filthy, caked with mud and what looked like dried blood. But she did not smell like someone who had been walking through the woods. She did not smell like anything at all. "Thank you," she said, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "You're kind." "Where do you need to go?" I asked, pulling back onto the road. "Home," she said again. "But not tonight. You should not go home tonight." I glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "You should not go home tonight," she repeated, still not looking at me. "Turn around. Go back. Do not go home tonight." A chill ran up my spine. "I don't understand. Where do you live?" "I can take you there, but then I need to get home. I have work in the morning." She finally turned to look at me. Her face was beautiful but hollow, like she had not slept or eaten in weeks. "If you go home tonight, you will not see morning," she said. "Please, turn around." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. This was a mistake. I should never have picked her up. "Look, I don't know what you are talking about, but I am not turning around. If you need help, I can take you to the police station in—" "The road," she interrupted, her voice sharp now. "Watch the road." I looked back at the windshield just in time to see the curve ahead. I was going too fast, distracted by the conversation. I touched the brakes and brought the car back under control. My heart was hammering. "You need to focus," she said quietly. "You need to stay alert." "Who are you?" I asked. "How did you end up out here?" She did not answer. She just stared out the window at the passing trees. We drove in silence for maybe 5 minutes. The fog was getting thicker, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I had slowed to about 30 miles per hour, leaning forward to see the road. "I died on this road," she said suddenly. I nearly slammed on the brakes. "What?" "A long time ago. I was going to a dance. A boy was driving too fast. He lost control in the fog. I was thrown from the car." She spoke matter-of-factly, like she was reading from a script. "They did not find me until morning. By then it was too late." I could not breathe. I glanced at her, and for just a second I saw something else. Not a young woman in a white dress, but something translucent, fading, not entirely there. Then I blinked, and she was solid again. "This is not real," I whispered. "You are not real." "I'm real enough," she said, "and so is what is waiting for you. Turn around, Grace." "How do you know my name?" My voice cracked. "I did not tell you my name." She smiled sadly. "Turn around. Please. I cannot save everyone, but I can save you." I do not know why I listened. Maybe it was the fear in her voice. Maybe it was because somewhere deep down, I knew she was telling the truth. I found a wide spot in the road and turned the car around. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. "Good," she said. "Go back to town. Stay at the motel. Go home in the morning." "What happens if I go home now?" I demanded. "What am I avoiding?" She turned to look at me last time. "You will see," she said. "In the morning, you will see." I looked away from her for just a second to check the road. When I looked back, the passenger seat was empty. She was gone, vanished, like she had never been there at all. I pulled over and sat there shaking for 10 minutes. I checked the seat, the door, everything. No sign she had ever been in the car. No mud from her feet. No indent in the seat cushion. Nothing. I drove back to town in a daze and checked into the cheapest motel I could find. I did not sleep. I just sat on the bed staring at the wall, trying to convince myself I had hallucinated the whole thing. Exhaustion, carbon monoxide from my dying car, something in the coffee at the diner. When dawn came, I got in my car and drove home. The road was blocked 3 miles from my house. Police cars, ambulance, fire trucks. I pulled over and walked up to a sheriff's deputy I recognized from the diner. "What happened?" I asked. He looked grim. "Rockslide. Happened around 3 this morning. Whole section of the cliff face came down and covered the road. We are lucky nobody was driving through when it hit." He walked me up to see it. Tons of rock and debris had buried the road completely. Trees had been knocked down. Boulders the size of cars were scattered across both lanes. "If someone had been here," the deputy said, "they would not have stood a chance, would have been crushed instantly." I stood there, staring at the destruction, and I knew with absolute certainty that I should have been here. If I had not turned around, if I had kept driving home, I would have been right here when the mountain came down. I asked around town after that. Described the woman, the white dress, the location where I picked her up. An old man at the hardware store got very quiet when I told him. "That is Elizabeth Callaway," he said. "Died in 1963. Car accident in the fog, just where you said. She was 17, heading to a homecoming dance. They say she never left the road. People see her sometimes, always on foggy nights, always trying to warn people." He leaned in close. "My brother saw her in 1981. She told him to turn around. He did not listen. Went off the road a half-mile later and wrapped his truck around a tree, broke both his legs. I do not drive Route 23 at night anymore. I take the long way around, even though it adds 30 minutes to my commute. And whenever I see fog rolling into the hollows, I think about Elizabeth Callaway in her white dress, walking barefoot along the shoulder, still trying to save people from the road that killed her. Some ghosts are not trying to scare you. Some ghosts are trying to save you from becoming one of them. I believe that now. I have to believe it because the alternative is that I am losing my mind, and the evidence is buried under 50 tons of rock on a mountain road in Kentucky. I do not know why she chose to save me that night. Maybe I just happened to be there. Maybe she saves everyone she can. Maybe she is still looking for the boy who was driving that night in 1963, the one who walked away while she bled out in the dark. What I do know is this: I should be dead. By every logical measure, I should have died on that road. But I'm here, telling you this story, because a ghost in a white dress cared enough to warn me. And that is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. My name is Mason, and I'm going to tell you about the weekend my best friend disappeared from existence, and I'm the only person who remembers he ever lived. I have photos. I have text messages. I have proof that he was real. But according to everyone else, including his own family, he never existed at all. This happened 2 years ago in late September. 4 of us decided to do a camping trip in the Appalachian backcountry, deep in the mountains of West Virginia. It was supposed to be a guys' weekend. Me, my buddy Jake, and 2 friends from college, David and Chris. We had been planning it for months, looking for somewhere truly remote, somewhere we could disconnect and just exist in the woods for a few days. Jake found the location, Blackwater Hollow. It was not on any of the major hiking maps, but he had discovered a reference to it in some old forum post from 2009. The post described it as an abandoned coal mining town from the 1940s, left to rot when the mine closed. Supposedly, the buildings were still standing frozen in time, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. It sounded perfect. The trailhead was barely marked, just a faded wooden sign that said Blackwater Access, with an arrow pointing into the trees. We parked Jake's truck and started hiking around noon on Friday. The trail was overgrown but followable, winding down into a narrow valley between 2 steep ridges. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our boots on the trail and our own breathing. We reached the hollow around 4 in the evening. and Jake was right. The town was still there. It was like stepping into a photograph from 70 years ago. There were maybe 20 structures scattered along what used to be a main street. Company houses, small and identical, with sagging porches and empty windows. A larger building that might have been a store or meeting hall. And at the far end, partially collapsed, the entrance to the mine itself. A black mouth carved into the mountainside with rusted rail tracks leading inside. The whole place felt wrong. Not scary exactly, just off. Like we were trespassing somewhere we did not belong. The air was heavy and still, and there was this smell, musty and mineral, like wet stone and old metal. "This is amazing," Jake said, already pulling out his camera. He was obsessed with abandoned places, always dragging us to explore old factories or forgotten buildings. We should set up camp and then check out some of these houses before it gets dark. We found a relatively clear spot near what used to be the town square and pitched our tents. The sun was already dropping behind the western ridge, throwing long shadows across the buildings. We had maybe an hour of good light left. Jake wanted to explore the mine. David and Chris thought that was a terrible idea and voted to check out the houses instead. I did not care either way, so we split up. David and Chris went to explore the residential section. Jake headed toward the mine entrance. I went with him because somebody needed to make sure he did not do something stupid. The mine entrance was partially blocked by a cave-in, but there was still a gap large enough to squeeze through. Jake went first, clicking on his headlamp. I followed, my own light cutting through the darkness. The air inside was cold and damp, and our footsteps echoed off the stone walls. The main tunnel extended maybe 50 feet before branching off in multiple directions. The ceiling was low, supported by rotting timber beams that looked like they could collapse any second. Rusted mining equipment was scattered everywhere. Carts, pickaxes, lanterns with broken glass. "We should not go too deep," I said. "This place is not stable." "Just a little further," Jake said. He was always saying that. Just a little further. Just one more turn. Just 5 more minutes. We followed the main tunnel for what felt like 100 yards, maybe more. The walls were getting narrower, pressing in. That is when we heard it. Voices. Faint and distant, echoing from somewhere deeper in the mine. Multiple voices talking and laughing. The distinct sound of metal striking stone. Jake and I froze. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded. "There are people down here." But that did not make sense. We had not seen any other vehicles at the trailhead. The town had been completely empty. Who could possibly be working in a mine that had been closed for 70 years? Jake started moving toward the sound. I grabbed his arm. "No, we should go back and get the others." "It is probably just some other explorers," he said. "Or maybe some local historians documenting the mine. Come on." He pulled away from me and kept walking. I hesitated, then followed. I was not going to let him go alone. The tunnel sloped downward and curved to the right. The voices were getting louder. I could make out individual words now, though they sounded strange. Old-fashioned somehow. And then we rounded the corner and saw them. Men. At least a dozen of them, working in a larger chamber carved out of the rock. They wore dirty overalls and cloth caps, their faces black with coal dust. They were loading ore into carts, swinging pickaxes, talking amongst themselves like it was just another day at work. And here's the thing. Their clothes were wrong. Their tools were wrong. Everything about them was wrong. They looked like they had stepped out of a history book. Like they belonged in the 1940s, not 2023. Jake took a step forward. "Hello," he called out. Every single one of them stopped working and turned to look at us. Their faces were blank, expressionless. And then one of them, an older man with a thick gray mustache, pointed directly at Jake. "You do not belong here," he said. His voice echoed strangely, like it was coming from very far away and very close at the same time. "You need to leave." "We were just exploring," Jake said. "We did not know anyone was down here." The man shook his head slowly. "You do not understand. You cannot be here. This place is not for you." The other miners were starting to move toward us, not aggressively, but purposefully, like they were herding us back the way we came. And that is when I noticed their eyes. They were empty, flat and black, like they were looking through us rather than at us. "Jake, we need to go," I said. "Right now." He did not argue. We turned and ran back through the tunnel, our headlamps bouncing wildly off the walls. Behind us, I could hear footsteps, heavy boots on stone, and voices calling out words I could not quite make out. We burst out of the mine entrance and into the twilight. David and Chris were standing by our tents looking confused. "What is wrong?" David asked. "You guys look like you saw a ghost." "There are people in the mine," Jake said, breathing hard. "We need to leave. Now." Chris laughed. "People? Come on, nobody lives out here." "I'm serious. There were at least a dozen of them, dressed like coal miners from the 1940s. They told us we did not belong here." David and Chris exchanged glances. "Are you guys messing with us?" Chris asked. Before we could answer, we heard it. A sound coming from the mine entrance, a deep rumbling, like the entire mountain was shifting. And then a man emerged from the gap in the rocks. It was the older miner with the gray mustache. He stood there at the entrance, staring at us across the distance. Even from 100 feet away, I could see his empty black eyes. "Pack everything," I said. "We are leaving right now." We threw our gear into our packs in less than 5 minutes and started back up the trail. It was almost fully dark now, but we did not care. We used our headlamps and kept moving. The entire time, I felt like something was following us just beyond the edge of the light. We made it back to the trailhead around midnight. Jake's truck was right where we left it. We loaded up and drove straight back to town, not stopping until we hit the first gas station with lights and people. That is when things got strange. We were sitting in the parking lot, drinking coffee and trying to process what happened, when David said something that made my blood run cold. "So wait, there are 4 of us here. Who drove?" I looked at him. "What are you talking about?" "Jake drove, in his truck." David frowned. "Who is Jake?" I stared at him. "Are you serious?" "Jake, our friend Jake. He is sitting right there." I pointed to the passenger seat where Jake had been sitting not 30 seconds ago. The seat was empty. Chris was looking at me like I had lost my mind. "Mason, there is nobody there. It is just the 3 of us. Me, you, and David. There is no Jake." I pulled out my phone and opened my photos. The pictures from the trip. Jake was in half of them. I turned the phone around to show them. They saw a completely different image. Just me, standing alone in the woods. But on my screen, Jake was right there next to me, grinning at the camera. I called Jake's number. It rang. He did not answer. I called his parents. His mother picked up on the 3rd ring. "Hello, Mason," she said. She knew my voice. We had been friends since middle school. "Is Jake there?" I asked. "I need to talk to him." Long silence. "Mason, I do not know anyone named Jake." Over the next few days, I did everything I could to prove he existed. I showed people text messages, photos, videos, and every single person looked at me with concern and pity. They saw empty spaces where Jake should have been. They saw messages from no one. They had no memory of him at all. Even his house was gone. I drove to his address, and there was a different family living there. They had been there for 15 years. I still have the photos on my phone. I can see him clear as day. Jake Walker, my best friend since 7th grade. But I am the only one who can. He went into that mine, and he never came back out. Something in Blackwater Hollow took him. Not his body. His entire existence. He was erased from reality, and I am the only one who remembers. I went back to find that trailhead 6 months later. The sign was gone. The trail was gone. It was like it had never been there at all. I do not know what that place was. A time slip. A pocket dimension. Some cursed ground where the past and present overlap in ways they should not. All I know is that my friend is gone, and I am left holding memories of someone who apparently never existed. Except he did exist. I have proof. And that is the worst part. Being the only one who knows the truth. My name is Lily, and I need to tell you about what I found buried beneath my grandmother's property in the mountains of Tennessee. What started as a simple inheritance turned into the unraveling of a family secret that had been hidden for over 40 years. A secret that involved illegal moonshine, blood feuds, and murder. My grandmother passed away last spring at the age of 92. She had lived her entire life in a small cabin on 60 acres of Appalachian forest, deep in the hills where the roads turn to gravel and cell service becomes a memory. I had visited her maybe a dozen times growing up, always in summer, always for just a few days. The place felt frozen in time. No internet, no television, just kerosene lamps and a wood stove and the constant sound of wind moving through the trees. When she died, she left everything to me. I was her only grandchild, and my mother had passed years before. The lawyer handling the estate told me the property was worth very little. The cabin needed extensive repairs, the land was too remote to develop, and honestly, he suggested I just sell it for whatever I could get and move on. But I did not want to sell, not right away. I needed time to go through her things, to understand who she had been. My grandmother was not a warm woman. She was hard and silent, and carried herself like someone who had survived things she refused to talk about. I wanted to know her story before I let go of the last piece of her. I drove up to the cabin in June. The place looked even more run down than I remembered. The porch was sagging, shingles were missing from the roof, and the yard was overgrown with weeds and wild blackberry bushes. But inside, everything was exactly as she had left it. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her dishes were still in the sink. It was like she had just stepped out for a moment and would be right back. I spent the first few days cleaning and sorting. Most of her possessions were worthless. Old clothes, broken furniture, stacks of magazines from the 70s. But I kept finding odd things. A cigar box full of cash, nearly $3,000 in old bills. A loaded revolver hidden under the mattress. And in the back of a closet, wrapped in oilcloth, a journal written in her handwriting. I sat on the porch that evening and read it cover to cover. It was not a diary exactly, more like a ledger. Lists of names, dates, and dollar amounts. Transactions, deliveries, payments. It took me a while to understand what I was looking at, but eventually it became clear. My grandmother had been running moonshine, not just a little backyard operation either. According to the journal, she had been moving hundreds of gallons per month throughout the 60s and 70s, supplying half the county with illegal liquor. The money she made was carefully documented, along with notes about who could be trusted and who could not. One name appeared again and again, always with angry notations. Beside it, Rufus Carver. My grandmother had written things like, "Rufus late again, shorted $20, and Rufus asking too many questions, and finally, near the end of the journal, Rufus knows too much. Problem." The entries stopped abruptly in October of 1977. I did not know what to make of it. My grandmother, this stern old woman who went to church every Sunday and never touched a drop of alcohol in front of me, had been a bootlegger, and apparently she had problems with someone named Rufus Carver. I decided to do some renovations on the cabin while I figured out what to do with the property. The place needed so much work that I hired a local contractor, a man in his 50s named Dale, who had grown up in the area. He took one look at the cabin and said the foundation was shot. We would need to dig out underneath and pour new supports if I wanted the place to last another 10 years. That is when we found it. Dale and his crew were digging out the crawl space under the cabin when one of them hit something solid about 4 feet down. At first, they thought it was a rock, but when they cleared the dirt away, they realized it was concrete. A concrete slab, roughly 6 feet by 3 feet, buried directly beneath the cabin floor. Dale called me over. "Miss Lily, "You might want to see this," he said. His face was pale. We broke through the concrete with a sledgehammer. Beneath it was a shallow grave, and in that grave were human remains. The skeleton was partially decomposed, still wearing rotted clothing. A man, based on the size and build, and lodged in the rib cage was a bullet, a single gunshot wound to the chest. I called the sheriff. Within an hour, the property was swarming with police and forensic investigators. They excavated the entire grave, cataloging everything. The remains were carefully removed and transported to the state medical examiner. It took 3 weeks to get the results. The skeleton belonged to a man named Rufus Carver, age 38 at the time of death. He had been reported missing in November of 1977. Cause of death was a gunshot wound to the heart, fired at close range. He had been dead for over 40 years. The sheriff came to see me personally to explain what they had uncovered. Rufus Carver had been a known moonshiner in the area, one of several who operated in the mountains during Prohibition and well after. He had a reputation for being greedy and untrustworthy, someone who would cut deals behind your back and steal from his partners. In the 70s, there had been a series of violent confrontations between rival moonshine operations. Stills were destroyed, trucks were ambushed. At least 2 other people had disappeared during that time, though their bodies were never found. The local authorities suspected it was all connected to bootlegging feuds, but they could never prove anything. People in the mountains do not talk to police. They handle their problems themselves. According to the investigation, my grandmother had been part of a larger network of moonshiners. She was not cooking the liquor herself, but she was a distributor, using her remote property as a storage and transfer point. Rufus Carver had been her partner for several years, but at some point, he had started skimming money and threatening to report her to the authorities if she did not give him a bigger cut. The sheriff believed my grandmother had killed him, shot him, buried him under her own cabin, and poured concrete over the grave to hide the evidence. Then she had continued living in that house for another 43 years, walking over his body every single day. I did not want to believe it. I wanted to think there was some other explanation. Maybe someone else killed him and buried him there without her knowledge. Maybe she had been protecting someone. Maybe it was self-defense. But then I found the gun. It was still hidden under her mattress where I had found it weeks earlier. I had not thought much of it at the time. Lots of people in the mountains kept guns for protection. But the sheriff ran a ballistics test on it, and the results came back positive. The bullet in Rufus Carver's chest had been fired from my grandmother's revolver. She had killed him, there was no doubt. The case was officially closed due to the death of the primary suspect. There would be no trial, no justice, no answers beyond what the evidence told us. Rufus Carver's family finally had closure after decades of wondering what happened to him. And I was left with the knowledge that my grandmother was a murderer. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it since then, trying to reconcile the woman I knew with the woman who pulled that trigger. My grandmother was hard because she had to be. She lived in a world where showing weakness could get you killed. She operated outside the law because that was the only way to survive in those mountains during those years. And when Rufus Carver threatened everything she had built, she made a choice. I'm not saying it was the right choice. I am not excusing what she did, but I understand it in a way I wish I did not. The Appalachian Mountains have always been a place where people make their own rules, where disputes are settled privately, and the law is something that happens to other people in other places. My grandmother was a product of that world. She did what she thought she had to do, and she carried that secret to her grave. I sold the property 6 months later. I could not live there knowing what was buried beneath it. The new owners tore down the cabin and built something modern and clean, something with no history. I kept the journal and the gun locked in a safe deposit box that I will probably never open again. Rufus Carver was buried properly next to his parents in a cemetery outside town. His sister, now in her 70s, thanked me for finally giving her brother peace. She said she had always known something bad had happened to him, but she never imagined this. I think about my grandmother sometimes. I wonder if she felt guilty. I wonder if she had nightmares, or if she just accepted what she had done and moved on, the way people in the mountains have always done. Surviving is not always pretty. Sometimes it is brutal and bloody and leaves scars that never fully heal. That is the truth about Appalachia that people do not talk about. Beneath the beauty and the folklore and the music, there is a history of violence. Family feuds that lasted generations. Blood spilled over insults and territory and money. And people like my grandmother, who did terrible things and never spoke of them again. I carry that legacy now, the knowledge of what my family was capable of, and I am still trying to decide what that means for who I am. My name is Elijah, and I work as a mine safety inspector in the coal country of West Virginia. I have been doing this job for 12 years, and in that time, I have seen collapsed tunnels, dangerous gas leaks, and equipment failures that could have killed dozens of men. But nothing in my training prepared me for what I experienced in the abandoned sections of the Blackstone mine, where the dead refused to stay silent. The Blackstone mine has been in operation since 1952, though large portions of it were sealed off decades ago after a series of accidents made certain tunnels too dangerous to work. The worst of these happened in 1923, long before Blackstone Mining Company even owned the property. Back then, it was called the Harlan Deep Mine, and on a February morning, a methane explosion ripped through the eastern tunnels, collapsing over 300 feet of shaft and trapping 14 miners underground. The rescue efforts lasted 4 days. They could hear the men down there, trapped behind tons of rock, singing hymns and old folk songs to keep their spirits up. The rescuers worked around the clock, but the unstable rock kept collapsing faster than they could clear it. On the 5th day, the singing stopped. All 14 men died down there, suffocated by bad air and crushing darkness. Their bodies were never recovered. The company sealed the tunnel and built new shafts in a different section of the mountain. That was 90-something years ago, but the miners who work in Blackstone today still talk about the old tunnels. They say you can hear things down there if you get too close to the sealed sections. Voices, music, the sound of picks striking stone. Most of the men refuse to go near those areas, and management does not push the issue. Superstition runs deep in coal country, and you do not mess with a miner's sense of what is right and wrong underground. I never gave much credence to ghost stories. I am a practical man. I deal in measurements and regulations and safety protocols. But my job requires me to inspect every accessible part of the mine, including the sections near the old sealed tunnels. That is where I was working when I first heard them singing. It was a Tuesday morning in March. I was alone, which is standard procedure for routine inspections in dormant sections. The mine was quiet that day. Most of the crews were working 2 levels down, and the sound of machinery was a distant rumble that barely reached where I stood. I was checking for structural integrity near Junction 7, a crossroads where 3 tunnels meet about half a mile from the main shaft. That is when I heard it. Faint at first. So faint I thought it was just the mountain settling or wind moving through the ventilation system. But then it became clearer. Men singing. Multiple voices, rough and harmonizing, echoing from somewhere deeper in the darkness. I stopped and listened. The song was old, something I recognized but could not quite place. Hymn, maybe, or a ballad. The kind of song my grandfather would have sung. The voices were strong despite the distance, and they had that particular quality that comes from men singing together in enclosed spaces, rich and resonant. I clicked on my headlamp and moved toward the sound. I knew I should not. I knew those tunnels were supposed to be sealed, but I needed to know. If there were men down here, if someone had broken through into the old sections, it was a massive safety violation, and I needed to document it. The singing grew louder as I walked. It was coming from the eastern tunnel, the one that led toward the sealed-off areas. I checked my gas detector. Methane levels were normal. Oxygen was good. Nothing that would explain why I was suddenly feeling dizzy and disoriented, like I was walking through water instead of air. The tunnel sloped downward and curved to the right. My lamp beam cut through the darkness, illuminating old timber supports and rusted rail tracks that had not been used in decades. The walls here were different than the working sections, older, rougher, hand-carved in some places. And then I saw them. Miners. At least a dozen of them, working in a wider section of tunnel about 50 yards ahead. They had lanterns, the old oil kind that cast flickering yellow light across the rock walls. They were loading ore into carts, swinging pickaxes, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this work their entire lives. I froze. This was impossible. Nobody should be here. This section had been closed for decades. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded strange, muffled somehow. "This area is restricted. You need to come with me right now." Every single one of them stopped working and turned to look at me. Their faces were smudged with coal dust, making it hard to see their features. But their eyes were visible, dark and hollow, and looking at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. One of them stepped forward. He was older than the others, maybe in his 50s, with a thick gray beard and a battered mining helmet. He regarded me silently for a long moment, then spoke. "You should not be here, son." His voice was wrong. It echoed too much, like it was coming from far away, and right next to me at the same time. "This is not your place." "This mine is my responsibility," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need you and your men to come with me to the surface right now. This section is not safe." The old miner shook his head slowly. "We cannot leave. We have been here a long time. We have work to do." Behind him, the other miners had gone back to their tasks, picking at the rock, loading the carts, singing that same low hymn I had heard before. But now that I was closer, I could make out the words. "Abide with me. Fast falls the eventide. The darkness deepens. Lord, with me abide." It was a funeral hymn, the kind sung at burials and wakes. My hands were shaking. "Who are you?" I whispered. The old man smiled, but there was no joy in it. "We are the ones who stayed behind. We are the ones who could not find the light." He raised a hand and pointed past me, back the way I had come. "You need to go. Now. The bad air is coming." "What are you talking about?" "The bad air," he repeated. "It will be here soon. You need to warn them. Get everyone out." I stumbled backward, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. These were not living men. I knew that now. Their clothes were wrong. Their tools were wrong. Everything about them belonged to a different era. These were the 14 miners who died in 1923. I turned and ran. My lamp bounced wildly as I sprinted back through the tunnel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I could still hear them singing, but the sound was fading, growing distant and hollow. I burst out of the eastern tunnel and into Junction 7, fumbling for my radio. "Control, this is Inspector Daniels. We have a potential methane problem in the eastern dormant section. I need all crews evacuated immediately." The response was instant. "Inspector, we are not showing any gas readings. Can you confirm?" "I do not care what the sensors say," I shouted into the radio. "Get everyone out now. This is not a drill." To their credit, they did not argue. The evacuation alarm sounded throughout the mine, and within 20 minutes, every single worker was accounted for on the surface. The mine supervisor was furious with me, demanding to know what the hell I was thinking calling a full evacuation based on nothing. That is when the sensors started going off. Methane levels in the eastern section spiked to dangerous levels in less than 10 minutes. A massive pocket of gas had somehow been released from the old sealed areas, flooding through the tunnels. If the crews had still been working 2 levels down, they would have been caught in a potential explosion zone. The mine was shut down for 3 days while we vented the gas and investigated the source. They never did find a clear explanation for what caused the release. The seals on the old tunnels were still intact. There was no structural failure, no earthquake, no drilling that might have broken through. The methane just appeared, as if the mountain itself had decided to exhale. I filed my report and left out the part about the singing miners. I knew nobody would believe me. Hell, I barely believed it myself, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I went back to that junction 7 weeks later, after the mine reopened. I stood at the entrance to the eastern tunnel and listened. Nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the distant rumble of machinery. But on the wall near the tunnel entrance, someone had carved words into the rock. Old words, worn smooth by time but still readable. In memory of the 14, February 1923, they sang until the end. I have worked in that mine for 5 more years since that day. I have never heard the singing again, but other inspectors have reported strange sounds near the old sections. Voices, footsteps, the rattle of ore carts on tracks that no longer exist. The current miners leave offerings sometimes. A bottle of whiskey placed at Junction 7. A pack of cigarettes. A small carved cross. Nobody admits to leaving them, but they appear regularly. Tributes to men who died almost a century ago and refuse to be forgotten. I do not know what I experienced that day. A mass hallucination brought on by low oxygen. A temporal anomaly. The actual ghosts of dead miners reaching across time to save the living. I do not have answers. All I have is the certainty that something in those tunnels warned me, and that warning saved lives. The mountain remembers its dead. The coal seams hold memories of every man who died in the darkness, every life lost to cave-ins and explosions and bad air. And sometimes, when conditions are right, those memories become tangible. They reach out. They try to help. I'm grateful to those 14 men. They could have stayed silent. They could have let history repeat itself. But they sang their warning, the same way they sang in their final hours. And because of them, nobody died that day. I will carry their song with me for the rest of my life. My name is Chloe, and I need to tell you about the camera I found on the Appalachian Trail and the photographs inside it that nobody can explain. What started as a simple day hike turned into an investigation that is still ongoing, and every time I think about those final images, I have trouble sleeping. I am an avid hiker. I have been exploring the Appalachian Trail system for 6 years, covering sections from Georgia to Virginia. It is my escape, my therapy, the one place where I can disconnect from the world and just breathe. I usually hike alone, which I know some people think is dangerous, but I am careful. I carry a GPS, a satellite emergency beacon, and I always let someone know my route before I leave. This happened last October during peak fall foliage season. I was hiking a section of trail in the North Carolina mountains, a moderate 10-mile loop that winds through dense forest and offers spectacular views from several rocky outcroppings. It is a popular trail, and I expected to see other hikers, but the weather forecast had called for rain, so most people were staying off the mountains that weekend. I started early, around 7 in the morning, hoping to beat the weather. The trail was wet from overnight rain, and fog hung thick between the trees, creating that eerie effect where visibility drops to maybe 20 feet in any direction. I love hiking in conditions like this. Everything feels muted and private, like the forest belongs to you alone. I was about 4 miles in, climbing a steep section with exposed roots and slick rocks, when I saw something bright orange just off the trail. At first, I thought it was trash, maybe a discarded water bottle or food wrapper. But as I got closer, I realized it was a camera bag. A nice one too, professional looking. The kind photographers use to protect expensive equipment. It was sitting at the base of a tree about 10 feet from the trail, partially hidden by ferns. The bag was soaked through, and when I opened it, water poured out. Inside was a digital camera, a Canon with a good lens, the kind that costs $1,500 at minimum. Also in the bag were 2 extra batteries, a lens cloth, and a small notebook with a waterproof cover. The camera itself was ruined. Water had gotten inside the body, and the screen would not turn on, but the memory card was still intact. I pulled it out and tucked it into my pocket, then looked around for any other signs of who might have left this here. There were no footprints visible in the mud, no other belongings, no sign of a struggle or accident. Just the camera bag sitting there, like someone had carefully placed it and walked away. I hiked out and reported the find to the park ranger station. They took down my information and said they would check for any missing person reports that matched the area. In the meantime, I kept the memory card, planning to see if there were any photos that might help identify the owner. When I got home, I put the card into my laptop and opened the folder. There were 214 images, all taken over the course of what appeared to be a 3-day backpacking trip. The first photos were dated 5 months earlier, in May. The initial images were exactly what you would expect from a hiking trip. Beautiful landscape shots, sunlight filtering through trees, close-ups of wildflowers and mushrooms. A few selfies of the photographer, a young woman in her late 20s with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, smiling at the camera with mountains in the background. She looked happy, excited to be there. The photos were time-stamped and appeared to follow a logical progression. Day 1 showed her at a trailhead, then hiking through forest, then setting up camp near a stream. Day 2 showed her packing up, more hiking, views from a ridgeline, and then camp again in a different location. Everything seemed normal. Day 3 was when things changed. The morning photos showed her breaking camp in dense fog, similar to the conditions I had hiked in when I found the camera. But around mid-morning, the images started to feel off. There were several shots of the trail ahead, and in the background of each one, just barely visible through the fog, was a figure. At first, I thought it was another hiker. The figure was maybe 50 yards behind her, just a dark shape in the mist. But as the photos progressed, the figure appeared in more and more of them, and it was getting closer. 40 yards, 30 yards, 20. The woman had clearly noticed. Several photos were taken looking back over her shoulder, like she was trying to get a clear shot of whoever was following her. But the fog and distance made it impossible to see details. Just a tall, dark figure, moving steadily closer. Then there were photos of her hiking faster. The camera angles became less composed, more rushed. She was not stopping to frame shots anymore. She was just documenting, checking behind her. Image 163 showed the figure maybe 15 yards back. Definitely humanoid. Tall, at least 6.5 feet. Wearing dark clothes or maybe just silhouetted by the fog. But here is what made my stomach turn. The proportions were wrong. The arms were too long. The way it moved, captured across several sequential photos, was not quite human. Too smooth. Too deliberate. The next 20 photos showed the woman trying to leave the trail. She was pushing through underbrush, climbing over fallen trees, clearly trying to lose whoever or whatever was following her. But in every photo where she looked back, the figure was still there, maintaining the same distance, moving through the forest with impossible ease. Image 190 showed her setting up her tent in the middle of the day. Not at a campsite, just a random flat spot in the woods. The photos taken from inside the tent showed her hands shaking as she zipped the door closed. Through the mesh window, you could see the forest outside, and standing about 10 yards away, partially obscured by trees, was the figure, just standing there, watching. The next photos were taken over several hours, time-stamped from 2 in the afternoon until well after dark. Each one showed the view from inside the tent, and in each one, the figure was still there, sometimes in the same spot. Sometimes it had moved to a different angle, but always watching, always still. The final sequence of photos started at 11:37 at night. The camera flash illuminated the inside of the tent. You could see her sleeping bag, her backpack, her boots lined up near the door. And then, in image 208, you could see something else, a hand coming through the tent fabric. Not unzipping the door, not tearing through, just pushing through the material like it was not even there, the tent bending inward around long, thin fingers. Image 209 showed the hand reaching toward the camera. Image 210 was mostly black, like the camera had been knocked aside or covered. Images 211 through 213 were blurry, chaotic, impossible to make out. Movement, darkness. What might have been fabric or hair or something else entirely. Image 214 was the last one. It showed a close-up of a face, not the woman's face, something else. The features were wrong. The eyes were too large and too dark. The mouth was open wider than any human mouth should open, and it was looking directly into the camera lens. I stared at that photo for a long time, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light or a double exposure or something rational, but I could not explain it away. Whatever that thing was, it was not human. I took the memory card to the police. They ran a search for the woman based on the selfies from the first day. Her name was Amanda Pierce. She had been reported missing by her family in June after she failed to return from a solo backpacking trip in the Pisgah National Forest. Her car had been found at a trailhead. No other trace of her had ever been discovered. The police investigated the area where I found the camera. They brought in search and rescue teams and cadaver dogs. They searched for 2 weeks. They found nothing. No body, no campsite, no other gear. Just the camera bag, right where I had found it. The official conclusion was that Amanda had gotten lost, succumbed to exposure or injury, and that wildlife had scattered her remains. The photos were dismissed as misidentified images of another hiker or distortions caused by fog and camera settings. The final image was attributed to accidental activation of the camera inside her pack. But I have those photos. I've looked at them hundreds of times. That was not another hiker. That was not a distortion. And that final image was not accidental. Something followed Amanda Pierce through those woods. Something tall and wrong and patient. And whatever it was, it found her. I do not hike alone anymore. I do not hike in fog, and I carry more than just a GPS and emergency beacon now. I carry something else too, though I am not sure it would do any good. Because if something like that wanted to find you in those woods, I do not think there is any way to stop it. The rangers tell people that the Appalachian Trail is safe. Thousands of people hike it every year without incident, and that is true. But Amanda Pierce is not the only person who has vanished in those mountains without a trace. There are dozens of unsolved disappearances, people who went into the forest and simply never came out. I think about her a lot, about those final hours in the tent, knowing something was outside, watching and waiting, about that hand coming through the fabric, about whatever she saw in those last moments before the camera stopped recording. Her family still does not have closure. They never found her body. They never got answers. All they have is what I gave them, a memory card full of photos that raise more questions than they answer. And somewhere in the North Carolina mountains, in the deep woods where the fog rolls thick and the trees grow so dense that sunlight barely reaches the ground, something is still out there, still watching, still waiting for the next solo hiker who wanders too far from the marked trail. I hope to God I never see it myself. My name is Henry, and I need to tell you about the property I bought in the Virginia mountains and the nightmare I uncovered beneath it. What should have been a fresh start turned into a federal investigation that is still ongoing, and I am not sure I will ever feel safe sleeping in the dark again. 2 years ago, I was looking to escape the city. I had just gone through a brutal divorce, lost my job in the pandemic downturn, and needed a complete reset. I spent months searching for affordable land in rural areas, somewhere I could build a small cabin and start over. Most properties were way beyond my budget, but then I found a listing that seemed too good to be true. 60 acres in a remote valley in southwest Virginia, already cleared and relatively flat, with road access and a well. The price was absurdly low, maybe a third of what comparable land was selling for. The real estate agent was upfront about why. The property had what she called a complicated history and had been sitting on the market for over 5 years. Previous owners had abandoned it in the late 80s, and it had been seized for unpaid taxes. The county just wanted someone to take it off their hands. I did not ask too many questions. I should have. I closed on the property in April and drove out to see it for the first time as the legal owner. The valley was beautiful in that isolated Appalachian way. Steep wooded ridges on 3 sides, a creek running through the western edge, and the cleared acreage sitting in the middle like a bowl. There were no other houses visible, no power lines, no signs of civilization except the gravel road that dead-ended at my property line. There were also ruins. The foundations of several buildings, maybe 8 or 9 of them, arranged in a rough circle around a larger central structure. Everything had been burned. You could still see the char marks on the concrete slabs, and here and there, twisted metal beams jutted up from the rubble. Whatever had been here, someone had deliberately destroyed it. I started clearing the site, planning to build my cabin on the eastern side away from the ruins. I hired a local guy named Thomas, who owned an excavator to help grade the land and dig a foundation. He showed up the first morning, took one look at the property, and his face went pale. "You know what this place was, right?" he asked. "Some old farm or something," I said. "Everything burned down years ago." Thomas shook his head. This was the Fellowship of the Eternal Light, a religious group. Some people called them a cult. They lived here in the 70s and 80s, kept to themselves mostly, but there were rumors. Bad rumors. He told me what he knew. The fellowship had been started by a man named Pastor Silas Crow in 1971. He bought the land and brought maybe 40 or 50 followers with him, families and single people, all looking for spiritual enlightenment away from the corruption of modern society. They built dormitories, a common kitchen, a chapel, and workshops. For the first few years, they seemed harmless enough. They grew their own food, homeschooled their children, and occasionally came into town to sell crafts and vegetables. But around 1978, things changed. People stopped seeing the fellowship members in town. Families who tried to visit relatives in the compound were turned away at the property line, sometimes at gunpoint. A few members tried to leave and told stories about increasingly strict rules, mandatory punishments, and Pastor Crow claiming to receive direct messages from God. By 1985, the state was investigating reports of child abuse and neglect. Before authorities could act, the compound burned. When firefighters finally reached the site, the place was completely destroyed. No bodies were found, but Pastor Crow and at least a dozen followers, including several children, were never seen again. The official theory was that Crow got wind of the investigation and fled with his most loyal followers, burning the compound to destroy evidence. But nobody knew where they went, and none of them were ever located. Thomas did not want to work on the property after telling me that story, but I convinced him it was just history. Tragic history, but nothing that should stop us from moving forward. He agreed, reluctantly, and we started the excavation work. We found the bunker on the 3rd day. We were digging the foundation on the eastern side, well away from the ruins, when the excavator bucket broke through into empty space. Thomas killed the engine, and we both climbed down to look. There was a hole about 4 feet across leading down into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it into the opening. It was a concrete room, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, buried about 8 feet underground. There was a metal ladder bolted to one wall. Against my better judgment, I climbed down. The bunker was cold and damp, and it smelled like earth and decay. The walls were bare concrete, and the floor was dirt. But someone had been here. Recently. There were blankets in one corner, a 5-gallon bucket for waste, and a metal ring bolted to the wall with a chain attached. The chain ended in a shackle, and the shackle was sized for a child. I felt sick. This was not an old storage cellar or root bunker. This was a prison, a place to keep someone against their will. I climbed out and called the sheriff. 2 deputies arrived within an hour, followed by a forensics team from the state police. They spent 2 days excavating and documenting the bunker. What they found was worse than I could have imagined. Scratched into the concrete walls were names and dates, dozens of them. Names of children, some as young as 6 or 7, with dates spanning from 1979 to 1989. Messages too, desperate pleas. Please help me. I want my mom. He says God told him we are sinful. One message, carved deeper than the others, said he took Sarah and Michael. They did not come back. The forensics team found biological evidence in the dirt floor, hair, dried blood, and bones, small bones, carefully buried in shallow holes around the perimeter of the room. They brought in ground-penetrating radar and searched the entire property. They found 3 more bunkers, all buried in different locations, all containing similar evidence. Chains, names carved in walls, remains. The investigation expanded rapidly. The FBI got involved, and within a week, my property was swarming with federal agents, forensic anthropologists, and investigative teams. They excavated all 4 bunkers completely and brought in cadaver dogs to search the woods. They found 11 sets of remains, all children, ranging in age from 5 to 14. All had been dead for at least 30 years. Cause of death varied. Some showed signs of blunt force trauma. Others appeared to have died from neglect or starvation. One child, a girl around 8 years old, had evidence of prolonged restraint and repeated physical abuse. The media descended on the story. It became national news. The Whisper Valley cult killings. Experts on religious extremism gave interviews. Former members of the fellowship who had escaped in the 70s came forward with horrifying stories. Pastor Crow had become increasingly paranoid and controlling in the late 70s. He claimed that some of the children born into the fellowship were possessed by demons and needed to be purified through suffering. The bunkers were where he kept the children he deemed most contaminated, subjecting them to isolation, starvation, and ritualistic abuse until they either submitted completely or died. When the state investigation began closing in on him in 1985, Crow apparently decided to destroy all evidence. He burned the compound, but he did not flee alone. According to testimony from former members, he took at least 12 of his most loyal followers and 7 children with him. Where they went, nobody knows. There have been no confirmed sightings of Silas Crow since 1985. He would be 83 years old now if he is still alive. But here is the part that keeps me awake at night. The bunker we found, the first one, the one we discovered by accident, it had recent activity. The blankets were modern, manufactured within the last 5 years. The waste bucket was plastic, a type that was not even produced until the 2000s. Someone had been using that bunker, and not 30 years ago. Someone had been down there, in that prison, in the last few years. The FBI investigated but could not determine who. No fingerprints. No DNA matches in the database. They theorized it might have been transients or teenagers exploring the abandoned property. But I do not believe that. Those blankets were folded. That bucket was clean. Someone knew what that bunker was, what it had been used for, and they came back to it. I think Silas Crow is still alive. I think he is still out there, somewhere, in these mountains, still practicing his twisted version of faith. And I think he or his followers came back to this valley, came back to the place where they buried children, and they used those bunkers again. The FBI told me they are pursuing all leads, but the case is complicated by time and lack of evidence. They have increased patrols in the area and are monitoring missing person reports that might match the profile. But Appalachia is vast. There are thousands of remote hollows and valleys where people can disappear and never be found. I do not live on that property anymore. I could not. Just knowing what happened there, knowing that children suffered and died in the ground beneath where I was planning to build my home. It was too much. I sold it back to the county for $1. Let it return to forest. Let the trees reclaim it and hide those concrete scars under roots and leaves. The families of the children who were identified finally got closure. They buried their sons and daughters properly after decades of not knowing. But there are still unidentified remains. Children whose names were never recorded, who disappeared without anyone outside the cult even knowing they existed. And somewhere out there, possibly still alive, is the man who killed them. Silas Crow, pastor and predator, who built a kingdom of suffering in a Virginia valley and walked away unpunished. If you ever find yourself driving through the back roads of Appalachia and you see a place that feels wrong, a valley or hollow where the trees grow too thick and the silence presses too heavy, trust that instinct. Leave, because some places remember evil, and some men who commit it never stop. I will carry this with me forever. The knowledge that I bought land soaked in innocent blood, that I walked over graves without knowing, and the fear, the deep, unshakable fear, that whatever darkness created those bunkers is still out there in the mountains, still watching, still waiting. My name is Emily, and I need to tell you about the inheritance I received from my grandmother in the mountains of North Carolina and the dark bargain that came with it. What started as a summer visit to say goodbye turned into something I am still trying to understand, and every full moon I am reminded that some debts can never be fully paid. I grew up in Charlotte, about as far from the old mountain ways as you can get while still living in the same state. My grandmother lived in a hollow so remote that GPS could not find it, where the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away and the roads turned to mud whenever it rained. We visited her maybe once a year when I was a child, awkward visits where my mother would grow tense and my grandmother would watch me with eyes that seemed to see too much. My grandmother was what people in the mountains call a granny witch, not the Halloween kind with pointy hats and broomsticks. She was a folk healer, someone people came to when doctors were too expensive or too far away, or when the problem was something medicine could not fix. She knew which plants could stop bleeding and which could bring down a fever. She could cure thrush in babies and warts on hands. She spoke charms over sick livestock and made poultices that drew out infections. People respected her, but they also feared her a little. The way you fear something powerful that you do not fully understand. I had not seen her in 5 years when my mother called to tell me she was dying. Lung cancer, too advanced for treatment. She had maybe 2 months left, and she wanted to see me. Alone. I drove up in July, following the increasingly narrow roads until I reached the turnoff that led to her property. The house was exactly as I remembered it. A small cabin with a tin roof, a porch lined with mason jars full of dried herbs, and wind chimes made from old bones and bottle glass that clinked softly in the breeze. She was waiting on the porch, thinner than I remembered, her skin gray and her breathing labored. But her eyes were still sharp, still that unsettling green that seemed to look through you rather than at you. "Emily," she said, her voice rough. "You came. Good. We have things to discuss before I go." She made me tea from herbs I could not identify, and we sat on the porch while she told me things I'd never known. She had been a healer for over 60 years, she said. She had delivered babies and tended the dying and cured illnesses that would have killed dozens of people. But her gift had not come without a price. When she was 22 years old, her youngest son, my Uncle Michael, had fallen sick with meningitis. The nearest hospital was 2 hours away, and by the time they could have gotten him there, he would have been dead. She had stayed up with him all night, watching him burn with fever and convulse with seizures, knowing she was going to lose him. And in her desperation, she had done something she swore she would never do. She had called on something old. "There are entities in the mountains," she told me. "Spirits that were here long before the Cherokee, long before the first settlers crossed the hills. They do not have names that humans can speak, and they do not think the way we do. But they can be bargained with if you are desperate enough and brave enough or foolish enough to try. She had gone out into the woods at midnight and performed a ritual her own grandmother had warned her about. She had offered a trade, her son's life in exchange for service. The entity agreed. By morning, Michael's fever had broken. Within 3 days, he was completely healed, and my grandmother became bound to something she could not escape. The bargain was simple, she said. I would serve as a healer for as long as I lived, using the knowledge and power it gave me. And in return, once a month, when the moon is full, it would come to collect. Collect what? I asked. She looked at me with something like pity. A piece of me, a memory, a bit of warmth, a fragment of my soul maybe. I do not know what it takes exactly, only that after each visit I am a little less than I was before, a little colder, a little more hollow. She showed me her arms. In the dim light of the porch, I could see marks, not scars exactly, more like shadows embedded in her skin, dark patches that seemed to move slightly when I looked at them directly like oil on water. It has been taking from me for 53 years, she said, and now that I'm dying, the bargain needs to pass to someone else. It wants you, Emily. I stood up so fast I knocked over my tea. No, absolutely not. I did not agree to anything. Neither did I, she said quietly. But the entity does not care. The bargain was made. The debt must be paid. If you do not accept it willingly, it will take you anyway, and the terms will be worse. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get in my car and drive back to Charlotte and pretend this conversation never happened. But something kept me rooted to that porch, some instinct that told me running would not save me. What do I have to do? I asked. Over the next 3 weeks, my grandmother taught me everything she knew, which plants could heal and which could harm, how to read signs in the natural world, how to speak charms that were older than English, words and languages that had been dead for centuries, how to set bones and deliver babies, and draw sickness out of the body with nothing but intention and will. And she taught me how to prepare for the visits, how to create a circle of protection that would limit what the entity could take, how to ground myself so I would not be pulled away entirely, how to survive what was coming. She died on a Thursday afternoon in late August, sitting in her rocking chair on the porch, looking out at the mountains she had never left. I buried her in the small cemetery behind the house, next to my grandfather and the other family members who had lived and died in these hills. The first full moon after her death, I knew it was coming. I felt it at sunset, a pressure in the air like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I prepared the way she had taught me, drawing a circle of salt and iron filings around myself in the center of her cabin, lighting candles made from beeswax and herbs, speaking the words she'd made me memorize. It came at midnight. I cannot describe what it looked like because looking at it directly was impossible. My eyes would slide away, refusing to focus. It was shadow and cold and something that felt fundamentally wrong, like reality was bending around a shape that should not exist. It stood just outside my circle, watching me with attention that felt like being examined by something ancient and utterly inhuman. "You're the new healer," it said. The voice was not sound exactly, more like words appearing directly in my mind. "You will serve as she served, and I will take what is owed." I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but I stayed in my circle and nodded. It reached for me, and even though it never crossed the salt line, I felt its touch. Cold. So cold it burned. Something inside me shifted, and for a moment I was not in the cabin anymore. I was falling through darkness, and there were eyes in that darkness, watching, judging, hungry. Then I was back in the circle, gasping for air, and the entity was gone. The candles had burned down to stumps. My skin was covered in those same shadow marks my grandmother had shown me, dark patches that moved like living things. I checked the clock. 4 hours had passed in what felt like seconds. That was 3 years ago. I still live in my grandmother's cabin. People come to me now the same way they came to her. They bring sick children and infected wounds and problems that doctors cannot fix. And I help them because I have to, because that is the bargain. I have become a healer whether I wanted to or not. Every full moon, it comes back. I have learned to prepare better, to protect myself more effectively, but I cannot stop it completely. Each time it takes a piece of me. Sometimes it is a memory, something from my childhood that just vanishes like it never existed. Sometimes it is warmth, and I spend days shivering no matter how many layers I wear. Sometimes it is emotion, and I wake up unable to feel joy or fear or love, just a numb, hollow emptiness that takes weeks to fade. I am becoming like my grandmother, colder, harder, more distant from the world. I can feel myself changing, becoming something that is less human and more vessel for this gift that I never asked for. I have tried to break the bargain. I have researched and consulted with others who know the old ways, but every attempt has failed. The entity is too old, too powerful, too deeply woven into whatever agreement my grandmother made all those years ago. The only way out is death, and even then, I'm not sure it would let me go cleanly. So I endure. I heal people during the day and pay the price at night. I carry marks on my skin that grow darker with each passing month. I feel pieces of myself disappearing, bit by bit, stolen by something that feeds on human essence the way we breathe air. Sometimes people ask me if I regret it, if I wish I had refused, had run away, had let the entity take me on its own terms instead of accepting the bargain. And honestly, I do not know. The work I do is important. I have saved lives, eased suffering, helped people who had nowhere else to turn. Maybe that is worth the cost. Maybe that is what my grandmother believed. But on the nights when it comes for me, when I feel that terrible cold wrapping around my soul and pulling pieces away, I wonder how much of me will be left when this is finally over. How many more full moons until there's nothing inside me but empty space and shadow marks and the memory of a girl who used to be whole. The mountains remember everything. They hold bargains that were made centuries ago, debts that pass from generation to generation, prices that must be paid no matter how unfair the terms. My grandmother tried to save her son, and she spent the rest of her life paying for that moment of desperation. Now I am paying too, and someday, if I am not careful, someone else will inherit this burden from me. That is the truth about folk magic and old ways and power that comes from things older than humanity. It always costs more than you think, and the bill always comes due. I just hope there is still enough of me left to matter when it is finally paid in full. My name is Jackson, and I need to tell you about the 3 days I lost in an unmarked hollow in the West Virginia mountains, and why I can never find that place again, no matter how many times I have tried. What should have been a routine hunting trip turned into something that defies every rational explanation. And to this day, nobody believes me when I tell them what happened. I have been hunting in Appalachia since I was 12 years old. My father taught me. His father taught him, and so on back through generations. I know these mountains. I know how to read the land, how to navigate by landmarks, how to survive if something goes wrong. I am not some city person who wandered into the woods unprepared. That is important to understand. What happened to me was not the result of inexperience or panic or getting lost in the traditional sense. This was October of last year. Deer season had just opened, and I had taken a week off work to do some serious hunting in the backcountry. I was working solo, which is how I prefer it. I had my rifle, my GPS unit, my satellite phone, enough supplies for 5 days. I knew exactly where I was going, a section of national forest land about 40 miles from the nearest town, an area I had hunted twice before without incident. The first 2 days went perfectly. I saw plenty of sign, Got a decent buck on the second afternoon, dressed it, and hung it from a tree to collect on my way out. I was feeling good, confident, enjoying the solitude and the crisp autumn air. On the third day, I decided to explore a drainage I had noticed on the map but never investigated. It was a narrow valley running between two steep ridges, heavily wooded, with what appeared to be a creek running through the bottom. The kind of place deer like to bed down during the day. I marked my position on the GPS and headed down. The descent was steeper than I expected, and the woods were thick, mostly old-growth hardwoods with dense underbrush. But I'm comfortable in that kind of terrain. I just took my time, watching my footing, scanning for game sign. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I noticed something strange. My GPS unit was acting weird. The screen kept flickering, and the coordinates were jumping around like I was moving at impossible speeds. I stopped and tried to reset it. The screen went dark and would not turn back on. Dead. Even though I had charged it the night before, and it should have had 2 full days of battery life left. I pulled out my phone to check the time and maybe use the compass app. The screen was black, completely unresponsive. I tried turning it on. Nothing. The satellite phone was the same. All 3 devices completely dead within minutes of entering this hollow. That should have been my signal to turn around. But I am stubborn, and I figured I had marked my entry point clearly enough. I could backtrack without electronics. I had done it plenty of times before, so I kept walking. The hollow opened up after another 10 minutes, revealing a wider valley floor with a creek running through it, just like the map suggested. But there was something else. Buildings, or what was left of buildings. There were maybe a dozen structures scattered along the creek, all in various states of decay. Log cabins mostly, with stone chimneys and wooden shake roofs. Some were barely standing, just frames and rubble, but a few looked almost intact, like someone might still be living there. There was even smoke coming from one of the chimneys. I stopped at the edge of the tree line and watched. This was not on any map. No roads, no trails leading in. Just this hidden settlement in the middle of nowhere. Then I saw people. A woman came out of one of the cabins carrying a wooden bucket. She was dressed strangely, like something from a history book. A long dress with an apron, her hair covered with a bonnet. She walked to the creek, filled the bucket, and carried it back inside. A few minutes later, a man emerged from a different cabin. He was wearing overalls and a faded work shirt, a straw hat on his head. He carried an axe and started splitting wood from a pile near his porch. I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of historical reenactment, a off-grid community living like pioneers? But there was no explanation for why this would not be on any map, why nobody had ever mentioned it. I decided to approach. I needed help anyway, with my electronics dead and my bearings uncertain. I stepped out of the trees and walked toward the nearest cabin. The man with the axe saw me and stopped working. He did not wave or call out. He just watched me approach with an expression I could not read. When I got within speaking distance, I raised my hand in greeting. "Hey there," I called. "Sorry to intrude. I'm having some equipment trouble and I am a little turned around. Could you point me toward the main forest road?" He stared at me for a long moment. Then he looked past me, scanning the tree line like he was checking to see if I was alone. "You should not be here," he said finally. His accent was thick, mountain dialect that sounded like something from a century ago. "I did not mean to trespass," I said. "I'm just hunting in the area. If you can just point me in the right direction, I will be on my way." He shook his head slowly. "You do not understand. You should not be here. Nobody should be here. This place is not for outsiders." Before I could respond, the woman I had seen earlier came out of the cabin. She looked at me with wide eyes, then said something to the man in a language I did not recognize. Not English, not anything I had ever heard. He responded in the same language, and they both looked at me with something like fear. "I'm leaving," I said, backing away. "I will just head back the way I came." "You cannot go back," the man said. "Not the same way. The path does not work like that." I did not know what he meant, but I was thoroughly spooked now. I turned and walked quickly back toward the tree line where I had entered the hollow. Behind me, I heard more voices. Other people from the settlement coming out to see what was happening. I did not look back. I just kept moving. I reached the trees and started climbing back up the way I had come. Or at least I thought it was the same way. But the terrain looked different. The trees were spaced wrong. The slope was steeper. And there was no sign of the trail I had made on the way down. No disturbed leaves or broken branches. I climbed for what felt like hours. The light was fading, and I realized I had no idea what time it was. Without my phone or watch working, I could not tell if it was late afternoon or early evening. I just kept climbing, desperate to reach the ridge and get my bearings. When I finally crested the ridge, I found myself looking down into a different valley. Not the one I had started from. The landmarks were all wrong. I turned in a circle trying to spot something familiar. Nothing. I was completely lost. I spent the night on that ridge, huddled under a fallen tree trying to stay warm. I had my sleeping bag and some basic supplies, but no way to call for help and no idea which direction to go. When dawn came, I could not tell if it was dawn. The light was strange, flat and gray, like heavy overcast but without actual clouds, just a uniform pale sky that never seemed to change. I started walking, picking a direction at random and following the ridgeline. I walked for hours, maybe days. I honestly do not know. I never felt hungry or thirsty, which should have been impossible. I never got tired enough to need to stop for more than a few minutes. And the light never changed. That same gray half-illumination that could have been dawn or dusk or some permanent in-between state. I saw the settlement twice more while wandering, once from a distant ridge, the buildings visible in a valley below, and once I somehow walked right through it, emerging from trees to find myself on that same creek bank, with those same pioneer-dressed people staring at me like I was a ghost. The second time, the man with the axe just pointed. A direction, up and to the left. I followed his indication and walked into the trees. That is when I found my truck. It was sitting exactly where I had left it, at the trailhead parking area, but everything looked wrong. The trees were different colors. The light was different. And when I checked the date on the truck's console, I nearly passed out. 3 days had passed. 72 hours since I had entered that hollow, but according to my experience, it had been maybe 24 hours at most. One night on the ridge. One long day of wandering. That was it. I drove straight to the ranger station and reported what happened. They organized a search party to retrieve my deer and my gear from where I had left them. They found the deer, spoiled after 3 days hanging. But they never found my campsite. They never found any of my equipment. It was like that hollow had swallowed it all. I have gone back 4 times now, with maps and new GPS units and other people with me. I cannot find that unmarked hollow. The drainage is still there on the map, but when we hike to it, it is just a normal valley. No settlement, no buildings, no people dressed like pioneers. Just trees and rocks and water. My wife thinks I had some kind of episode. She looked up symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy and carbon monoxide exposure, things that might cause time distortion and hallucinations. But none of that explains my dead electronics, or the 3 missing days, or the fact that I emerged from the woods miles from where I went in. The few old-timers I have talked to in the local community just get quiet when I describe the place. One old woman, must have been in her 90s, told me that there are places in these mountains that do not follow normal rules. Pockets where time moves differently, or where the past bleeds through into the present. She said her grandfather talked about a hollow where people from the old days still lived, going about their lives like nothing had changed, like the modern world had just passed them by completely. She called it a thin place, where the boundary between worlds is permeable. I do not know what to believe. I am a practical person. I believe in what I can see and measure and prove. But I lost 3 days in those mountains. I saw things that should not exist, and I cannot find that hollow again, no matter how hard I try. Sometimes I think maybe I'm not supposed to find it. Maybe that place only appears to certain people at certain times, and once you leave, you cannot go back. Or maybe I am just lucky I got out at all, because I think about those people in their pioneer clothes, living in that timeless gray light, and I wonder if they are aware of what happened to them, if they know they are trapped in some pocket of reality that does not move forward, or if they think their lives are normal and everyone else has disappeared. I do not hunt alone anymore. I do not go into unfamiliar hollows, and I carry 3 separate GPS units and 2 satellite phones, though I am not sure any of them would work if I stumbled into that place again. The Appalachian Mountains are older than almost anything else on this continent. Older than the Rockies, older than most human civilizations. And maybe in their ancient folds and hidden valleys, there are places where time does not flow the way it should, where the rules we take for granted simply do not apply. I found one of those places, and I am grateful I found my way out, even if I lost 3 days and a good bit of my certainty about how the world works. My name is Abigail, and I need to tell you about the women in my family tree who vanished without a trace, and the terrible truth I uncovered when I started asking questions nobody wanted me to ask. What began as innocent genealogy research became a journey into generational violence that my own family helped to hide. I got interested in family history about 4 years ago when my grandmother died and left me a box of old photographs. I had always been curious about my roots, about the people who came before me and made me possible. My family is Appalachian, going back at least 7 generations in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. We are coal miners and farmers and people who never left the hollows where they were born. The photographs were fascinating. Stern-faced people in old-fashioned clothes standing in front of cabins and churches that no longer exist. But as I started organizing them and trying to identify who was who, I noticed something strange. There were gaps, missing people, women who appeared in one photograph and then simply vanished from the family record. I started building a family tree using online databases and census records. That is when the pattern became impossible to ignore. Between 1950 and 1955, at least 6 women from my direct family line had disappeared. Not died with death certificates and obituaries. Disappeared. Just gone from all records. Like they had been erased. The first was my great-great-aunt Sarah, born in 1932, married at 16 to my great-great-uncle Thomas. She appeared in the 1950 census, living with Thomas and their infant daughter. Then nothing. No death record, no divorce record, no indication she ever existed after that census was taken. Thomas remarried 3 years later, and the new wife raised Sarah's daughter as her own. Then there was cousin Martha, born 1941, married at 17, disappeared in 1962, leaving behind 4 children under the age of 10. Her husband told people she ran off with a traveling salesman. Nobody ever heard from her again. And Rebecca, born 1938, disappeared 1969. And Anna, born 1945, disappeared 1971. And Caroline, born 1952, disappeared 1964. All of them married young. All of them disappeared between the ages of 20 and 35. All of them left behind children who were raised by other family members or the very husbands they had vanished from, and all of them were related to the same man, my great-great-great-grandfather, William Harding, the patriarch who had settled our family in these mountains in the 1890s. I became obsessed with finding out what happened to these women. I started calling distant relatives, asking questions about family history. Most people did not want to talk about it. They would change the subject or tell me to let sleeping dogs lie. But a few of the older generation, women in their 80s and 90s, were willing to speak if I promised not to use their names. The stories they told made my blood run cold. The Harding men had a reputation, not publicly, not in any way that would be written down or acknowledged officially. But within the family and the immediate community, everyone knew. The Harding men were violent. They drank, they beat their wives, and if a woman tried to leave, or fight back, or seek help, she disappeared. One elderly cousin told me about Sarah, my great-great-aunt. She said Sarah had tried to run away in 1950 after Thomas broke her arm during a beating. She made it as far as her sister's house before Thomas showed up with his brothers. They dragged her back. 3 days later, Sarah was gone. Thomas told everyone she had abandoned her baby and run off to the city. But Sarah's sister swore she heard screaming coming from Thomas's property that night. Screaming that stopped suddenly and never started again. Martha, the cousin who supposedly ran off with a salesman, had actually gone to the sheriff to report her husband's abuse. The sheriff was a Harding cousin. He told her to go home and be a better wife. She tried to leave anyway. Her body was never found, but several people remembered seeing her husband and his father digging on their property late one night, carrying lanterns and shovels into the woods. The more I learned, the clearer the pattern became. These women had not vanished mysteriously. They had been murdered, killed by their husbands or other male relatives, buried somewhere on family property, and then erased from history. The community had known, or at least suspected, but in those days, in those isolated hollows, what happened in a family stayed in the family. You did not interfere in another man's marriage. You did not question when a woman disappeared. You just accepted the story you were told and moved on. I went to the police with what I had learned. They were sympathetic but realistic. These were cold cases from 50 to 70 years ago. Most of the men involved were dead. The properties where these women likely died had changed hands multiple times. There was no physical evidence, no witnesses willing to testify, no way to prove what had happened. But they agreed to investigate. They started with property records, identifying the land that had been owned by the Harding family during the relevant time periods. Most of it was still in the family, passed down through generations now belonging to distant cousins I barely knew. They got search warrants and brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment. They focused on 3 properties that had been owned by the husbands of the missing women, and in the fall of last year, they found the first body. She was buried in a shallow grave in the woods behind what used to be Thomas Harding's cabin. The bones were old and degraded, but forensic analysis confirmed they belonged to a woman aged 20 to 30. Dead for approximately 70 years. The skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma. She had been beaten to death. They found 2 more bodies on the same property, both women, both showing signs of violent death. On the second property, they found 1 body. On the third, they found 3. In total, they recovered 7 sets of remains, all women, all killed sometime between 1950 and 1975. DNA testing is still ongoing, but preliminary results have confirmed that at least 3 of the bodies belong to women from my family tree: Sarah, Martha, Rebecca. The others are likely the remaining missing women, though we may never know for certain. The investigation made regional news. Family property yields multiple bodies. Decades-old murders uncovered in Kentucky. The story was sensational, but also sadly familiar. Domestic violence murders, hidden and ignored, finally coming to light. I have been working with the families of the identified victims to give them proper burials. Sarah's daughter, now in her 70s, finally got to bury her mother after a lifetime of believing she had been abandoned. Martha's children, all in their 60s, wept when they learned the truth. Their father had told them their entire lives that their mother did not love them enough to stay. Now they know she tried. She tried to save herself and them, and she was killed for it. The living Harding men, my distant cousins and relatives, have mostly stayed silent. A few have expressed shock and claimed they knew nothing about any of this. Others have refused to comment. One older cousin told a reporter that the past should stay buried, that digging up old bones only causes pain, but I disagree. These women deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their names spoken and their stories told. They were not women who abandoned their children. They were not sinners who ran off with other men. They were victims. They were mothers and daughters and sisters who tried to escape violence and paid with their lives. I have created a memorial website for them. Photographs, if I can find them, birth and death information, their children's names. A record that they existed, that they mattered, that their deaths were not acceptable or justified or something to be hidden and forgotten. The response has been overwhelming. Other women from Appalachian families have reached out to me with similar stories. Missing aunts and grandmothers and cousins whose disappearances were never investigated, whose deaths were written off as runaways or accidents or just the way things were. There are dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Women who vanished from isolated communities where male violence was accepted and protected. I am working with a journalist now to document these cases. We are calling it the Forgotten Daughters Project. We are collecting stories, cross-referencing missing person reports, working with law enforcement to identify potential burial sites. It is slow work and often heartbreaking, but it feels important. My own family has mostly cut ties with me. They think I am airing dirty laundry, bringing shame on the family name. My mother has not spoken to me in a year. She thinks I should have left well enough alone that digging up the past only hurts the living. But the living were never the ones who needed protection. The dead were. The women who were beaten and killed and buried in unmarked graves, whose children were told lies about them, whose existence was erased because their murders were inconvenient truths. I think about them often. Sarah, who was only 18 when she died, leaving behind a baby girl who would grow up believing her mother did not love her. Martha, who went to the sheriff for help and was sent back to her killer. Rebecca and Anna and Caroline and all the others whose names I may never know. They deserved better. They deserved to be protected and believed and mourned. Instead, they got shallow graves and silence and decades of being forgotten. I cannot give them their lives back. I cannot undo the violence they suffered or the years their families spent without answers. But I can give them this: recognition, remembrance, justice, even if it is too late for punishment. The mountains have always kept secrets. The hollows have always hidden things people wanted forgotten. But some secrets are too big to stay buried forever. Some voices refuse to be silenced, even from the grave. These women are speaking now through the bones we found in the dirt, through the gaps in family trees, through the stories finally being told by those who remembered but were too afraid to speak. The forgotten daughters are forgotten no longer, and I will keep digging, keep asking questions, keep uncovering the truth, no matter how many people wish I would stop. Because somewhere in these mountains, there are more graves, more women who disappeared, more families who deserve answers. This is my inheritance, not property or money or family pride. This burden of truth and the responsibility to make sure these women are finally seen, I carry it willingly. For Sarah and Martha and Rebecca and all the others. For the daughters who were forgotten and the generations who never knew them. They mattered. They still matter, and their stories will be told.